שעשה ניסים לאבותינו בימים ההם בזמן הזה.
אמן. הנרות הללו שאנו מדליקים בימים ההם בזמן הזה.
חנוכה שמח to the whole world, לכל העולם. It's a historical moment in which we are now witnessing. It is exactly 600 years that the Jewish community of Vienna was destroyed and the people were burned in an auto da fe in March 1421. And now, 600 years later, we are standing here and we are lighting Nerot Chanukah. It is really a special feeling, הרגשה מיוחדת שמחזקת אותנו בהשקפה ובשכנוע שהרוח היהודית גוברת על כל שמד, גוברת על כל מה שאירע לעם היהודי מעתה ועד הנה. אני מאחל לכם, סניפי מזרחי בכל העולם, ולכם, מרכז עולמי של המזרחי, חג חנוכה שמח.
There's an interesting question the commentators ask about Chanukah. For 8 days we light lights, and for each night we make the blessing over miracles. She'asa nisim lavosenu. But what was the miracle of the first night? The light that should have lasted 1 day lasted for 8. But that means there was something miraculous about days 2 to 8, but nothing miraculous about the first day. Perhaps the miracle was this, that the Maccabees actually found 1 cruse of oil with its seal intact, undefiled. There was no reason to suppose that anything would have survived the systematic desecration that the Greeks and their supporters actually did to the temple. Yet the Maccabees searched and they found that 1 jar. Why did they search? Because they had faith that from the worst tragedy, something would survive. The miracle of the first night was that of faith itself, the faith that something always remains, with which we can begin again. So it has always been in Jewish history. There were times when any other people might have given up in despair after the destruction of the temple, or the massacres of the Crusades, or the Spanish expulsion, or the pogroms, or the Shoah. But somehow Jews didn't sit and weep. They gathered what remained, rebuilt our people, and lit a light like no other in history, a light that tells us and the world of the power of the human spirit to overcome every tragedy and to refuse ever to accept defeat. From the days of Moses and the bush that burned and was not consumed, to the days of the Maccabees and the single cruse of oil that kept on burning, Judaism has been humanity's Ner Tamid, the everlasting light that no power on earth can extinguish. Happy Chanukah. Chanukah Sameach.
Eve Harow, Israeli tour guide, podcaster, and public speaker. Today in the olive orchards of Meshek Achiyah in the Shilo block. And take a look at these olives. They're black. You know, there's no such thing as black olive trees. The longer they stay on the tree, the blacker they become and the more full of olive oil. This is just before the Mesik, the harvest of the olives, which is the last harvest that we have of the 7 species of the land of Israel. Eretz chita, se'ora, gefen, teina, rimon, zeit shemen, udvash. All right, so we just had the dvash, which of course was the date harvest of Sukkot, and now for Chanukah, we have the olive oil. How is olive oil connected to Chanukah? Well, we all know that, the menorah, and when they get the Beit HaMikdash back, the Hashmonaim, in minus 164, after 3 years of the Gzerot Shmad of Antiochus, they are now back in the Beit HaMikdash and they don't have enough oil for the menorah. But fortunately for them, it's this time of year. It's Kislev, and the olives are ripe for the picking. We can't understand our Chagim, and of course Chanukah is not a biblical festival, but we can't understand any of our Chagim without understanding the agricultural rhythm of the land of Israel. Chanukah could not have been Chanukah without the fresh olives that they were able to pick. And we have found places where there is a Beit Bad, which means an olive press right near a mikveh, which shows us that they were going to be tahor, and they were pressing these olives for something to do with religious ritual, and hence they had to be ritually pure. If you come here next year, these olives are going to have Kedushat Shvi'it. Next year is Shemitah year. It's an amazing what a fruit can be. It's going to be the same fruit as it is this year, but it's going to have the Kedusha, something that you can't really pinpoint, the spirituality. A little piece of fruit, yet it causes light. Because from olive oil, of course, we eat olive oil, there's soaps and all kinds of cosmetics, but it's also what we use to light the menorah, to light the Shabbat candles. From a piece of fruit, we can get light. From something that seems so little and so innocuous, and that could be like the Jewish people. We're a little people, yet we are an Or L'Goyim, and Chanukah is Chag HaOrim, from the relighting of the Mizbeach, from the relighting of the menorah. And it seems from our sources that the only time that the public saw the menorah being lit was that first Chanukah, because otherwise it was inside the walls of the Beit HaMikdash. But because the Beit HaMikdash had been semi-destroyed and the walls were broken, on that first Chanukah back of the Hashmonaim, we got to see the menorah being lit. And it's all because we were able to have the olive trees. You can't separate our holidays from the land of Israel, nor should you.
So we're standing on the roof of the Aish HaTorah World Center in the Old City with a beautiful view of not only the Western Wall Plaza, the wall, the Temple Mount itself, but in back of that we have a fantastic overlook of what's called the Mount of Olives, which is the mountain ridge that's to the east of the Old City of Jerusalem. There's a valley in the middle, which is called the Kidron Valley, and we're separated, the Old City, from the Mount of Olives by that valley. That mountain ridge is extremely important in Jewish history, mentioned many, many, many times. It's associated with the vision of the coming of the Messiah at the end of days, but we're talking about Hanukkah, and Hanukkah is the holiday of light. And people like to light their menorahs often with candles, but we know that Chidur Mitzvah, the proper way to do the mitzvah, is with olive oil itself. Olives being one of the 7 species mentioned specifically in the Torah associated with the land of Israel, and an incredibly important crop which had many different uses, but primarily it was used for light. And of course the most important light in that story is the light in the menorah itself, and the miracle that we focus on is that small pach shemen, that little teeny jar of oil, the one that was still considered pure, that was used by the high priest in the story. And we know that many of the trees used for processing the olive oil in Jerusalem were probably located around Jerusalem, and specifically the closest source of olive trees to the Old City itself would have been the Mount of Olives.
So of course we all associate Hanukkah with oily food, with latkes and with sufganiyot. The truth is though that olive oil is one of the healthiest foods that there are, but I must give you a little tip. I used to go to Costco when I could actually travel to America, and they sell olive oil in big plastic jugs. Never, ever, ever buy it in plastic. I don't care how cheap it is. The plastic dissolves into the olive oil. There's a chemical reaction. Only buy it in dark glass or in tin. That's why you see that the people who press olive oil here in Israel and around the world, that's what they put it in. Not to be snobby or boutiquey, because that's the way to keep your olive oil as fresh as possible. So when it comes to Hanukkah, have some olive oil, Try and have some Israeli olive oil if you can get it, because it's got that extra connection to Eretz Yisrael, to the Chashmonaim, and to the Chag. It's not just about the Sufganiyot. The biblical festivals and the harvest of the other 6 species all happen during Israel's dry season, between Pesach and Sukkot. The archaeologists have found ancient batei bad, ancient olive presses, in caves, because the harvest of the olives happens when hopefully our prayers have been answered, our prayers for rain. And in that season, when it's going to be raining on your olive press, you want it indoors. And hence, we have found ancient olive presses in caves, underground, a sign that the rainy season is upon us during this particular holiday. On the trail of the harvesting truck, the back of that vehicle is full of olives that were just shaken off the tree, and they're on their way to the olive press, the achiyah. And usually it's half an hour, maybe an hour from being on the tree to being olive oil. That's the best kind of olive oil, the shemen zach, the virgin olive oil, so that it doesn't get acidic, off the tree and right into the jar. How do we know that Chanukah is coming? Because it is the olive harvest. I'm here at Meshek Achia, which is the biggest olive press in the Shomron, and this is their conveyor belt. We just saw these olives on the tree. They're being brought in, up, washed, turned into olive oil within like an hour of being on the tree. We know Chanukah is coming when we live in the land of Israel because it's the olive harvest, it's the Mishsik, and it's an amazing thing to be a part of.
Shalom everyone. The connection between Chanukah and olive oil is rather obvious, for the whole miracle of Chanukah begins with the little container of oil that they found, that the Chashmonaim, when they restored the Beit HaMikdash, they were able to use that to light the menorah for 8 days. But the history of oil and the Beit HaMikdash goes way back to Sefer Breshit, and the very first time in Chumash that we find shemen, we find olive oil mentioned. When Yaakov Avinu is running away from the land of Israel because of his brother Esav, on his way out, he has his famous dream. And the site of his dream is the site of Beit El, the site of the Beit HaMikdash. And in his dream, God promises him that even though he's leaving the land, one day, God will make sure that he returns and begins the people of Israel. Let's take a quick look at what God tells him in that dream, and we'll see the very first time that we have the mention of oil and how it relates to the Beit HaMikdash. In the beginning of Parshat Vayetze, in chapter 28 in Sefer Breshit, Yaakov is on his way out from Beersheba, and notice the word makom, which is mentioned over and over again, Vayifga b'makom, and he takes from the avnei makom, he takes from the stones of that place, and he sleeps b'makomahu. The Torah for sure is highlighting the word makom. Recall that later on, the Beit HaMikdash in Sefer Devarim will be called Hamakom Asher Yivchar Hashem L'Shaken Shmo Sham. Yaakov has this dream. He sees the angels of God going up and down, and then God promises him that even though he's leaving, Haaretz Asher Ata Shochev Aleh Lecha Nenu Lezarecha, you're going to come back, and the land that you're now lying on, that one day will be the land for you and your offspring. And your offspring will be like the dust of the earth of Haaretz, the same promise God made to Avram Avinu when Avram was in Beit El back in chapter 13. We also have the 4 directions that God told Avram Avinu also back in chapter 13. His nation will bring blessings to all the nations, a repeat again of Avram's blessings. And then God promises Yaakov that even though he's leaving, I'll be with you, Hinenochi imach, ushmarticha b'chol asher telech, I'll be with you wherever you go. And finally, v'ashivoticha el adama azot, I'll bring you back to this land. Yaakov wakes up from his dream, he says, what an amazing place. And then he says, Ma noah hamakom hazeh, this makom, again, is very special. Then he says, Ein zeh kim beit Elohim v'zeh shar hashamayim, this place is fit to be a house for God. This is not only a prediction that one day a temple will be built there, Yaakov Avinu himself, as we'll see soon in his resolution, is hoping to build a house for God on this very site upon his return. How do we know that? Yaakov wakes up in the morning, Vayikach et ha'even, he takes the stone and he turns it into a matzeva. He makes a monument to remember that site. And then what does he do? He puts oil on the monument. Vayitzok shemen al rosha. He takes oil, which he had with him, and he puts oil on the monument, on the matzeva. And that's the first time we have shemen in the Torah. And then Yaakov calls the name of this place Beit El. Because why? He plans to build a house for God. And then Yaakov makes his famous neder. He makes his famous promise. What does he say? Yaakov makes neder, if indeed God will be with me and take care of me, and he brings me back to my land, then Hashem will be my God. Either meaning, then, as Ramban explains, I will work for God, I'll dedicate my life to God. And then his big promise. Pasach habet, va'even azot asher samti matzeva yeh beit Elohim. This rock, this stone, this matzeva, this monument that I erected where I fell asleep, I hope to make it one day a house for God. And I'll also support it with 10% of whatever income I have. So what do we see? Putting oil on the rock, on the matzeva, was the reminder to Yaakov, the consecration of this Evan, with this shemen, with this olive oil, is going to mark the site where Yaakov Avinu hopes to build the Beit HaMikdash. Later, upon his return to Israel in Parshat Vayishlach in chapter 35, he again repeats his promise and puts oil again. The only two times we have the word shemen in Sefer Bereshit. And unfortunately, in Yaakov's own life, there's too many tragedies, and he's unable to build that house for God. And even though he wishes he could build a house for God, the unfortunate circumstances in his life make him unable. But hundreds of years later, his offspring, especially during the time of King David, and later during the time of Shlomo Melech, of King Solomon, the Beit HaMikdash is finally built on that site of Yaakov's dream. This is extra special in regard to Chanukah, because we celebrate Chanukah even after the second temple was destroyed. We no longer have a Beit HaMikdash, but we're hoping that one day we will be able to rebuild it. And just like Yaakov Avinu was hoping that he'd be able to build his house for God, but his life circumstances did not allow it, that did not mean he gave up hope. He did something symbolic to remember that one day that goal will be fulfilled. We too on Chanukah, at this time in our history, we do not have a Beit HaMikdash, but we never forget that dream. And when we light our Chanukah candles, especially with olive oil, we can remember Yaakov's resolution that hopefully God will keep his promises and not just bring us back to our land, but also enable us to be in a position where we can build a house for God. And by lighting our Chanukah candles, we remember our long-term goals. We never forget them, even though our present situation may not enable us to do them. Everyone should have a wonderful Chanukah. Everyone should stay healthy. And Mirza Hashem, we will see our Beit HaMikdash rebuilt very soon in our own time.
Here I am in Jerusalem on the plaza of the Temple Mount which is in the Bible called Mount of Zion. As we celebrate the holiday of Hanukkah, right over here, where you can see there's the major big dome and the smaller dome. The smaller dome is the location of the altar. So when it says that Yehudah Maccabee comes to the Temple Mount and he purifies the altar, and they celebrate for 8 days the dedication of the altar. This is right where we are right now, where you're looking here. They were celebrating, and they announced that Hanukkah will be celebrated throughout history. And what happens was, and it doesn't matter whether you translate the story of Yehudah Maccabee as a religious issue, as a national issue, as a political issue, but the Yehudah Maccabee managed to defeat the Seleucids. He managed to defeat those who took over the Temple Mount, and he returned the hope of the people back and the celebration on the Temple Mount. It was quite obvious for Yehudah Maccabee when he comes to the Temple Mount that he's going to renew and rededicate and celebrate the rededication of the service of Hashem on this place, this exact place where Abraham brought his son and announced and taught us what could complete devotion and faith to God is, and where God recognized his faith, and the place which the prophets prophesied for the future to be the house of prayer for all nations and the world center of shalom, the world center of peace, the world center where lo yisagoy el goy cherev v'lo yilmedu od milchama. Today, after we've seen the great miracles of returning back home, the Jewish people coming back home from after thousands of years of exile, we are pleased and happy that more and more people come to the Temple Mount. More and more people visit the Temple Mount, and the Temple Mount is becoming a peaceful place. The Israeli law has outlawed all those who were causing violence here just till a few years ago. But still, unfortunately, they're not allowing us to hold a Bible here, to hold a prayer book here, to play, to bring a musical instrument and celebrate in honor of God here. And of course, they're not allowing us to worship. Maybe we're not ready. Maybe Hashem thinks we're not ready. But we have to say to Hashem what Abraham said to Hashem. Hineni, here I am. And I'm so happy that I have the privilege to come up here onto the Temple Mount, to ascend with the Israeli police accompanying us. And we hope that we will be able, right over here, to celebrate once again the dedication of the altar and the temple, which will serve as a house of prayer for all nations, as a world center of the faith in Hashem Echad U'Shmo Echad. Happy Chanukah to all.